everyone's welcome today. Thank you for your time during this COVID-19 crisis. Thank you for participating in this important events. So I'm a Professor Baogang He and chair in international relations at Deakin University. I'm also a fellow of Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. So what I'll do, I first introduce panelists first. So today we are honored to have three distinct speakers. First is Melissa Tyler. She is a research fellow in Asian Institute of the University of Melbourne. So she was a national executive director of Australia Institute of International Affairs for 13 years. Under her leadership, AIA was recognized as top think tank in Southeast and Pacific, and one of the top 50 think tank globally. And so Melissa is a prolific commentator on the Australia foreign policy, Australia key relationship across Asia, and the practice of the diplomacies. So Melissa, thank you. And our second speaker is Professor Tim Soutphommasane. Excuse me, it's my personal pronunciation of your name, Tim. So Tim is a director of cultural strategy at the University of Sydney. He was the Australian Race Discrimination Commissioner at the Australia Human Rights Commission from 2013 to 2018. He has previously been a political staffer for Bob Carr and Kevin Rudd. So he's published numerous books. One of his recent books is On Hate, published by University of Melbourne. So he will address this race politics, in particular impact Australia-China relationship on the Australia-Chinese here. And our third speaker is Professor Mark Beeson. He's a professor of international politics at University of West Australia. So before he joined University of West Australia, he taught at Murdoch, Griffiths, Queensland, York University in UK, and he's a founding editor of the Critical Study of Asia Pacific. His latest book is Thinking Global Governance. So he will address one of the important issues, the global climate governance issues. So today we will address two critical issues concerning relationship between Australia and China. So those two questions, first, what are the causes of the increased tension between Canberra and China? And what will the future of the bilateral relationship be in the next 5 to 10 years? So before we address those two important questions, let me discuss two unprecedented challenges that mankind faces. One is a COVID-19 virus, and the second one is a global warming. Those two pose the existential threats, crisis for mankind. And now mankind has waged two battles. The first battle is between human and non-human, that is a sort of invisible virus. And the second battle is between human survival and global warming. So the original and the spread of COVID-19 virus are one of the sources of the recently increased tension between Australia and China. In April this year, at the early days of spread of COVID-19, the Morrison government suggests that an independent international inquiry into COVID-19 should be undertaken to determine how a similar future pandemic scenario might be better handled. Beijing responded angrily and severely by imposed trade sanctions against Australia. So in this way, Australia has contributed to a sort of global blame game led by the Trump administrations. Since then, the relationship between Beijing and Canberra has been getting worse and worse. At the same time, the violence proved deadly, powerful, and endure. So when the whole world lack of a concrete, coordinate effort of contain the virus, COVID-19 virus has built into a new empire and expanded its territory across the whole globe within several months. COVID empire, a new empire today, was built through this divide and conquer strategy. That is, when the mankind is deeply divided, the virus spread quickly, widely, and conquered the whole world. So when the American domestic politics is so divided, then what do we say? The virus become a sooner winner in the United States. However, when the people are united, so as in here in Melbourne, under the leadership of Daniel Andrews in Victoria, and the virus become a loser. So Victoria has witnessed a successfully of defeating the second wave of the virus. Victoria's success is largely due to Daniel Andrews' strategy, a strategy of focus on the control virus, and he has wasted no time in playing any blame game. So this successful lesson, I think, needs to be translated into international areas, in particular to deal with Australia-China relationships. We need a new foreign policies towards China. Certain compromise, reconciliation is imperative, and international collaboration is vital in defeat the virus in the COVID-19 age. We are really come to the new age of politics. We need to set up a new priorities. To defeat COVID-19 virus, mankind need a unified actions. All the parties should not play any blame game. Instead, as Daniel Andrews has done recently, focus on concrete measures, including collaboration, put aside disagreement and dispute temporarily. So it is a common sense that to win the battle against this invisible non-human violence, mankind needs to be unified to deal with this common threat. First, human security should be put ahead of traditional security. Mankind must defeat violence first to ensure human survival first. Then we have a lecture to talking about freedom and sovereignty. So in this battle against the virus, then we have some basic principle of freedom and the sovereignty must be modified and compromised. The worsening relationship between Australia and China is a kind of symbol of the old politics. The politics is deeply divided by nation-state system and political ideology. To better deal with a bilateral relationship, we need a new perspective and a new approach, which need to put human interests, the common interests first. So within these splits, so we were exploring the vital question, whether Australia-China relationship should be developed in the next 5 to 10 years. In particular, explore how Canberra and Beijing should work together to deal with a set of global regional challenge issues. So in this context, so Melissa Taylor will discuss how and why the relationship between Canberra and Beijing has deteriorated, and will examine the proposed foreign relationship bill and its potential impact on the international engagement by Australia University, Council, and state government. So Tim in defending multiculturalism in Australia, he will discuss how the deteriorated relationship has impacted the life of the Chinese Australia. Finally, Mark Beeson, he will propose the way in which Australia could encourage G2, China and the United States to take a more constructive battle to address the looming reality of climate-induced catastrophe. That is in the second battle, which I discussed before. So now I would like to invite Melissa to give her talk first. Melissa, floor to you.
Thank you very much. I am speaking from Lockdown Central in Melbourne, specifically from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. My job today is to talk to you about where the relationship is at the moment and how it got there. And we'll be talking a little bit about what it might look like, I think, further with other speakers and in questions. So I'll be looking at really what have been the steps in the recent deterioration of the relationship between Australia and China. And then I'll finish up by talking about some proposed legislation, the Foreign Relations Bill, which I've been advocating against strongly, which I think will even make things worse, which is something of an achievement. And to be fair, I think I need to give you a vision of what I think the relationship might look like. Okay, so I'm using as my example something that was said by Ambassador Bilahari Kausikan, who's a very distinguished Singaporean ambassador now at National University of Singapore. And he said, I thought, a great example of what it is you should be aiming for in a relationship with China. You need to get along with China and you need to stand up with China. And if you are doing just one, getting along with or standing up to China, then you're doing it wrong. Okay, so with that as my framework, what I think a good relationship might look like, where are we today and how did we get there? I would say it's possible for Australia and China to have a good relationship. And, you know, there's a lot of things we have which are a good starting point. Unlike other countries, we have a trade surplus with China. In fact, China's been a huge part of the 3 decades of uninterrupted growth that Australia until recently enjoyed. We have no historical enmities, some of which are very deep in the region. We have no territorial disputes, and we have a big diaspora population. So if you think of that, those are all resources for the relationship. In 2012, for example, President Xi described the Australia-China relationship as a model relationship, essentially something that could be aspired to with other countries. And I think if you look back, say as long ago as 2014 to 15, you can see a real high point. So we agreed to the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. That's the high, in diplomat speak, that's the highest level relationship you can have short of being an ally. We agreed chapter, the free trade agreement, and President Xi made a visit, spoke to Parliament, etc. But as well as going to Canberra, I thought one lovely touch is he visited Tasmania, which meant that he had then visited every state and territory of Australia. And I have to say, there's not many world leaders who you could say that of. Fast forward to today, and Jeff Raby, one of our former ambassadors, says the relationship is the worst he's ever seen. We're not panda pals anymore. And you don't just have to take his word for it. If you look at the Lowy Institute polling, which they bring out every year, you can see the biggest ever drop in the warmth of the relationship towards China. And you can see here very graphically that there's been a switch between the seeing China as more of an economic partner to seeing China as more of a security threat. A big factor for that has been the coverage in Australian media. So I've given you some quick samples: espionage, foreign interference in politics, Belt and Road Initiative. And these have really soured the Australian public on the relationship and where it is, which in turn affects what Australia can do in foreign policy. So why? has this happened? And what I want to do is look at it from each side's point of view. From Australia's point of view, what's gone wrong, and then from China's. And I tried to limit it, because you could go on forever, to 5 main factors. What I'm interested in is that essentially most of these are indeed bilateral, genuinely bilateral. There's a context, which is rising US-China tensions, and I think that accelerates or heightens sensitivity around different issues. But a lot of them are really just about how do Australia and China manage our relationship with each other. So Australia has concerns about cyber attacks. And from an Australian perspective, that's a constant. It's happening all the time, literally every day, and for all I know, every hour. There's concerns about espionage. And we've had some, wonderful tabloid-style exposés, thrilling tales of alleged espionage. We've had allegations of foreign interference, and that's particularly China trying to influence Australian politicians. And we've now had that to a number of parties in a number of parliaments. We've had Australia being very concerned about human rights violations, both within China, so in Xinjiang, in the treatment of Uyghur people, and in Hong Kong, particularly security law, but then also specific concerns about Australians, consular cases. So I've got a photo there of the writer Yang Hongjun, but more recently we've had the TV anchor Cheng Lei, and there are others who are subject to Chinese criminal justice. And finally, there's been what people tend to talk about in shorthand as just Chinese assertiveness. And that means pushing harder in the South China Sea. It means moving into what Australia considers its patch in the Pacific, where Australia now is very worried that it will lose influence to China. So you put all of that together, and that looks concerning. What you then see is the rise of people who feel a very strong anti-China sentiment. So there's a group in Parliament called the Wolverines, they name themselves after an American movie, I believe, who want pushback against China. And they are becoming quite influential in a number of areas. In an own goal, for some reason, China decided to refuse some of them visas and told them that they needed to repent, which was never going to go down very well. So what I think you have today is a very polarised debate. And I think the most polarised I've seen in my working life. So if you say something in the public realm which is not entirely negative about China, you're suddenly a panda hugger. And I see that as dangerous. Foreign policy, identity politics makes it harder for us to make decisions which are in our own national interest. As an Australian who cares about foreign policy, I'm not pro or anti-China, I'm pro-Australia. And the question is, what can and should we do for our own national objectives? And I know, of course, Tim's going to talk a bit more specifically about what this toxic and polarised debate means and the effect on Chinese Australians. So if I do the same for the other side, for China, what are the issues from China's side? And look, very clearly, Australia is in the doghouse, as it were. So I've given you a picture there of the Global Times, which is very reliable in being anti-Australia at the moment. Their cartoonist has this wonderful line in making a kangaroo look terrible. He's either looking threatening or cowardly or suspicious and mean, but you get a good example there of what's going on. So from the Chinese side, what have been the issues? Certainly the decision to ban Huawei and ZTE from the 5G build, that was noticed and that was considered a problem. More than anything else, because we were on the vanguard. Other Western countries hadn't yet decided, and Australia taking such a clear view that they were going to be banned, it meant that others then followed. So that was an irritant. Foreign investment decisions are an irritant all the time in the relationship. So China finds our system of a foreign investment review absolutely opaque. They don't understand why are some acquisitions blocked and others not. So the most recent one, for example, there's a dairy company, milk dairy company, owned by a Japanese company who wanted to sell it to a Chinese company, and it got rejected on national security grounds. So that's the sort of thing they don't understand. For the foreign interference legislation, that was again something that I think really did lead to a bit of a step change in the relationship. It had an impact. I think it was perhaps less for what it said, because the idea of Australia, for example, banning foreign political donations, not a problem. It's something within our sovereignty and we can choose. The same for foreign interference legislation. I think it was more the way it was presented. So Malcolm Turnbull announced it by saying that Australia was going to stand up Aodalia Renmen Janji Dai, which is a play on one of the most famous of quotes attributed to Chairman Mao about the Chinese people standing up. And it is genuinely hard to see how he could have made that more offensive. So, there you have an effect. Obviously, human rights advocacy has, not been welcomed by China. They haven't appreciated Australia's public criticisms of human rights abuses, both in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong. And after the Hong Kong, national security law was passed, Australia's put in place a travel ban because of the danger of arbitrary arrest of Australians. So in that sense, it's sending very, very strong signals. And then last and most recent is the call for the COVID-19 inquiry that Baogang just spoke about. This, I think, was genuinely damaging. It was perceived as directed at China, and it was perceived as not the action of a friend. Now, I get a little wary when Chinese diplomats tell me, as they very often do, that something hurts the feelings of the Chinese people. But this time I think it was actually true. It was this sense of a kick in the guts, that China had suffered so much and done so much, and a country that they might think of as a friend was having this reaction. So the deputy ambassador in the Chinese embassy in Canberra, Wang Ximing, described that when he was speaking at the press club as, it was just like Brutus's betrayal of Caesar. So emotive, but often when that emotive stuff is used, it means something hit home for whatever reason. So what has China been doing? Well, it's gone to wolf warrior diplomacy. So the idea of wolf warrior diplomacy, if you haven't come across it, it comes from a Chinese movie, Wolf Warrior, which I think is a bit like a sort of Rambo. You've got a tough guy. And what we've seen is Chinese diplomats becoming less diplomatic, as it were. So, they're insulting their host countries. They're being really combative. Which is obviously counterproductive in the sense of diplomacy, but is clearly intended for a domestic audience. So in targeting Australia, it's been things like travel advice, discouraging tourists and students, various trade disputes and bans, and we're in the diplomatic deep freeze. And this is long-standing, may I say. The last time I was in Beijing, it was still on. That's a few years ago now. So officials won't meet our diplomats, won't meet ministers, and won't return calls. Interestingly, however, China says that there is no such ban, no such deep freeze. And that in itself is a sort of olive branch. You see, if publicly China's saying there's no deep freeze, then you don't have to reverse it. You can just start talking again whenever you decide to. So it would be lovely if Australians heard that and thought about it. We've had recently, I think, what look like two attempts to try to reset the relationship. So from Deputy Ambassador Wang, which I mentioned, but also an Australian Financial Review interview given by a former ambassador to Australia, Madame Fu. And, I think those are suggesting that there's unhappiness that we've got quite as low as we have in the spiral, and it would be useful to start picking up the relationship. So the question is, I suppose, will Australia respond? And at least from the evidence of some legislation that's currently in front of Parliament? I fear maybe not. So I'm going to talk briefly in my remaining couple of minutes about the proposed Foreign Relations Bill, which is currently before Parliament. It's currently with a Senate inquiry. What it does, or attempts to do if it's passed, is it takes all international arrangements, so essentially agreements, which are made by a local council, by a state government, or by a university. And this has to be notified to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the Minister for Foreign Affairs can then cancel them if she decides, essentially on a whim, that she doesn't like them. It was announced as this idea of Australia speaking with one voice. And I have to say, I've been advocating against that. You can see there, hashtag Foreign Relations Bill, hashtag overkill, because I think that's just fundamentally misconceived. Authoritarian countries try to speak with one voice. It is not at all clear to me that that's what Australia should be trying to do. So the sort of concerns I've been raising are, first, no rationale, no examples of where agreements by, say, local councils or universities have harmed Australia's ability to pursue its foreign affairs. So, where's the evidence that, I don't know, Darwin's sister city relationship with haiku, or having a University of Melbourne fine arts student having a semester abroad in Fudan? Where is the evidence that that is actually causing any harm to anyone? Secondly, there's just hugely wide definitions in all of this. It's any arrangement, whether in writing, that has in writing, whether it's legally binding or not. So it's sort of hoovering up thousands, tens of thousands of agreements. And that's the opposite of what you need if you're genuinely concerned about real threats. Coming from that, as you'll understand, huge, massive regulatory burden, both on the councils, universities and state governments, but also really importantly on the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I put out research at the end of last year showing that DFAT is now gets the lowest funding from the federal budget ever in its history. It is terribly stretched for real and important work pursuing our national interests. And the idea that it's going to be spending time checking about, Sydney Symphony Orchestra doing a workshop with Shanghai Conservatory of Music, or the state of Victoria doing a visual artist exchange with Jiangsu, it just seems to me absurd. I think it sends the wrong message right now, that international engagement is suspect, when actually we need the opposite. That 3 decades of uninterrupted economic growth came to an end. Where is our economic growth going to come from in the future? It's going to come from our connections internationally. So we need engagement in science, in business, in people to people. That's what we want at the moment. And the problem is, if it's made too hard, a lot of these things just might not happen. The local council may decide sending high school students on homestay, isn't worth doing, but that forms the connections that can turn into so much. And I think, just at that fundamental level, it's missing the whole nature of modern diplomacy, which is that it is a whole range of actors which are sending a message of Australia abroad. And it's not something that can be done just by the minister alone. So you can hear I'm passionate about that. I think in particular, it can be a trigger for worsening of relations. And if I use the example of, say, the foreign interference legislation, it means that the relationship is held hostage to decisions about decided by security agencies on whether a crime might perhaps have taken place. Okay, so here's just a little cycle of escalation. So the staffer, John Jung, for Soutphommasane, is in a WeChat group. ASIO gets concerned, raids the office, questions people who are in that group, which include Chinese journalists. Chinese government then talks to Australian journalists. An Australian journalist is detained. The Australian journalists are dragged out last moment in worries that they might be about to be arrested. We have a tit for tat. We then have some Australia revoking the visas of to Australian studies scholars, and then China decides it will revoke the visas. And so you get these sort of cycles of escalation. What I find scary about this is that original decision had nothing to do with foreign affairs at all. They wouldn't have even been in the loop. So we have things that matter so much to our relationship being set by that legislation. Now, because I have to end up with something positive, I don't just want to talk about how it got here. It's not inevitable that it has to get worse. Okay, as you can see from what I've discussed, each of these were concrete decisions made. We could have made other decisions. It's not inevitable. We can make different choices. I think at the moment in Australia, the security mindset is dominant. Security agencies, negative media, think tanks with a particular agenda essentially seem to be running the relationship. And I think we need more nuance. Now, I'm conscious that even using that word means that someone online is going to tell me that I'm an appeaser. But nuance is what we need. We have to be asking what's in Australia's interest and ask that in a rational way. What we need to be is a country that can both stand up to and get along with China. And I think we're only getting half of it right. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Melissa. That's a really wonderful overview. So let's turn to the team.
Thanks, Baogang. Just building on Melissa's comprehensive overview there and reflecting on what this debate means for not only Chinese Australians, but for Australian society at large and for our multiculturalism. I think 2020 has been a year that's done a lot of damage to our multiculturalism and has done a lot of damage to Australians of Chinese and Asian background. And a lot of that has to do with the debate that Melissa's summarized for us there, and the rising concern in public debate about the Chinese Communist Party and foreign interference with our public institutions. It's also got a lot to do with this remarkable pandemic year that we've been confronted with. COVID-19 has unleashed a good amount of racial prejudice, and unfortunately Chinese and Asian Australians have been on the receiving end of that. So I'd like to just reflect a little on how this came about and what the real ramifications are going to be for our multiculturalism, because while it's often said that Australia is the most successful multicultural society in the world, or at least among the most successful, which is the view that I would myself subscribe to, we can't take that success for granted. And if we're not careful with the way that we conduct our public debates, we can easily undermine social trust and cohesion in ways that will take many, many years for us to rebuild. But let's start with the public debate about China at the moment. And I think there's no better illustration of where the debate has gone than what happened 2 weeks ago in the Australian Parliament, when 3 Australians of Chinese heritage gave testimony to a Senate inquiry into diaspora communities in Australia. And Senator Eric Abetz demanded from 3 witnesses of Chinese background who are Australian citizens, some of them were born in Australia, to unequivocally condemn the Chinese Communist Party. In essence, demanding a public statement of loyalty and allegiance to Australia. Now, this was done not on the basis of any determination or any reasonable judgment that these people were connected to the Chinese Communist Party. It was done ostensibly because they had Chinese heritage. Now, I think there's only one very simple description of what we saw 2 weeks ago, and that is we are seeing a McCarthyist mode of rhetoric entering into our public debate, and there are federal parliamentarians who believe it is permissible to target people for tests of loyalty and allegiance, primarily, if not exclusively, on the basis of their ethnic background and heritage. And it's absurd. If you're a member of our society and an Australian citizen, I think you're entitled to enjoy presumption that you are loyal and have allegiance to this country. I mean, it's not as if we go around demanding that Australians of German ancestry denounce Nazi Germany simply because they have German ancestry. We don't do that. Nor do we, for that matter, ask serious questions of Australians who work for foreign powers and actually work for foreign powers. We don't, for example, demand a public affirmation of national loyalty from former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, who has recently joined the British government's Board of Trade. You know, actively working for a foreign power, but there's no question about national loyalty or allegiance there. Yet there is such a demand when Australians of Chinese heritage enter into public debate. And it's a standard that isn't applied to any other group in society. I mean, if you were to demand that standard across our society, then you would demand right now that the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister unequivocally and publicly condemn the Chinese Communist Party too. A point that was well made by my academic colleague, Wan Sun of UTS, I believe, who asked, well, if we're not asking of our Prime Minister and our Foreign Minister such statements, then why are we demanding from ordinary Australians that they must do so before they can enter into public debate? That's the territory in which we have wandered, and it's dangerous stuff. And I worry about the consequences it's going to have on our public debate, not least what it's going to mean for the willingness of Australian citizens who have Chinese ancestry or who may have Asian backgrounds to engage in debates about Australia's place in the world. Because if you're going to be subjected to this kind of scrutiny, you may well decide that it's not a price worth paying. And that would diminish our public life, it would diminish our public debate, and it would debase our democratic character as a society. This has been, of course, exacerbated by some of the rhetoric that has been swirling this year as a result of COVID-19. We know that the virus emanated from Wuhan, but the language that's been used in describing COVID-19 by some political actors has been fraught with danger as well, referring to COVID-19 as the Chinese virus or the China virus or the Wuhan virus, making close associations with Chinese people. This has fed into hostility against Chinese and Asian Australians. And there have been efforts made by civil society advocates to try and gather some evidence on the experience of racial discrimination and hatred this year. And it does appear that there has been a significant surge in racial vilification directed at those of Asian backgrounds. And this has been confirmed by authorities, including the Australian Human Rights Commission, also a number of state anti-discrimination bodies. And you look at that experience and you look at the broader context of disinformation and misinformation, and you've got a potent mix. Remember when we were all in lockdown? I know friends in Melbourne have been in lockdown until just very recently, but if you recall the first wave of the virus hitting Australia around February and March, and the panic buying that occurred more or less across the country. Remember those rumors that were doing the rounds of busloads of tourists leaving metropolitan city centres, going into regional centres in order to clean out regional shopping centres of toilet paper and other supplies? I mean, that was a sign of unsubstantiated rumours spreading very quickly, and the implication of such rumours was very clear. We weren't talking here about Anglo-Australian tourists necessarily on buses. The implication was very clearly that these were people from Chinese and Asian backgrounds doing the hoarding. That's the kind of discourse I think we've seen in 2020 that has reinforced, or in many ways has emanated from this fear that people have about the Chinese party state. After all, when rumors like this spread, you've got to ask, well, where did it come from? Why does it have credence, or why does it have traction? And I think it has traction because in recent years, we have seen a ratcheting up of the political rhetoric about the Chinese Communist Party, about a so-called silent invasion, and about the proliferation of so-called panda huggers in our public institutions. That's what allowed these rumors to take hold. People were willing to believe the worst of Chinese and Asian Australians because there were reasons readily put forward for suspecting disloyalty and treachery. What does this all mean? Well, I think there is a very fundamental challenge being posed here to our multiculturalism, and in more ways than one. It's not just that public debates are leading to demands, whether explicit or implicit, of public statements of loyalty from Chinese Australians. The very closing of, or the closure of our international borders has reflected the psyche of a fortress Australia. Now, I think there are sound public health reasons for having closed the borders. I certainly don't believe that there should be an indefinite closure of borders. If anything, we should be moving to reopen borders as soon as it's possible and deemed appropriate from a public health perspective. But it's the psychology of Australia closing down, of Australia retreating inwardly, and the fear and insecurity that people have about COVID-19 that may have longer lasting effects on how we think of immigration and how we think of our relationship with the world. I do think there is this framing at the moment of anything outside Australia posing a threat, whether that's of the biological kind, or whether that's, or biosecurity kind, or whether that's of the political kind. And I think you can only sustain an open multicultural society with a substantial immigration program if people don't look at the rest of the world as a source of profound threat. When you have that mindset of a fortress Australia, it makes multiculturalism and openness much, much more difficult. On top of this, I think we are seeing in many liberal democracies a steady normalization of racism and prejudice. If you look at the debates in the United States, in parts of Western Europe, we have seen a resurgence in far right-wing extremism. And we've seen this here in Australia too. Our security agencies have said very clearly and publicly that far right extremism is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, terrorism threats that we have in Australia today. And the rising temperature that we are seeing in the debate about China, I fear, can feed into that far right extremism. If we're not careful, we have the ingredients here of a potent explosion of racial hatred. So what do we do then in light of all this? I think on the diplomatic front, my colleagues on this panel are much better qualified than I am to offer some prescriptions. I think I want to challenge people to think about what we need to do to our own institutions and how we conduct our debates within Australia, because we can't protect our society and uphold our open, liberal, multicultural character unless we deal with diversity better within our institutions. I mentioned the chilling effect of debates about Chinese-Australian relations on those who may have Chinese backgrounds. If we don't have parts of our society coming forward, taking part in debates, or indeed putting themselves forward for election to public office, then our institutions are not going to be properly representative of the society that it serves. I think this is a real challenge for us in future years. But the first step to dealing with that challenge requires just stronger political leadership on these issues. I think it's been frankly disgraceful that we have not seen senior government officials condemn the McCarthyist bullying being conducted by Eric Abetz and others of Australians who have Chinese heritage. It shouldn't be that hard. It should be pretty simple. You should reject racism, and you should allow Australians of all backgrounds to participate in public debate without having their public loyalty or their national loyalty questioned because of their ethnic background or heritage. It is really that simple. And I think it's been deeply disappointing to see our political leaders deflect questions about their views on this by saying the only citizenship or the only loyalty test that matters is the test that people take when they become Australian citizens. Well, what if you're Australian born and you never take that test? You know, I think there's a serious need here for just some political decency and strength to combat the kind of racism that is creeping into our public debate and which threatens to undermine our public institutions in very significant ways.
Well, thank you, team. Wonderful. And so, by the way, so all the audience participants, if you have any question, please just write down your question, put the Q&As. And now let's turn to Mark, Professor Mark Beeson.
Okay, thanks, Baogang. Baogang has given me the very easy task of talking about climate change and solving all the world's problems in about 15 minutes or less. So it's not going to be easy, but I've got a few ideas about it. I think the starting point for thinking about this is to build on both the presentations from Melissa and Tim, and particularly about this question of the national interest, because it's striking that a government, the Morrison government, bangs on about the national interest endlessly, but doesn't have a very sophisticated view of how it might be pursued at times. And it's striking that the attitude towards China is very much at odds with the attitude towards the United States. And as Tim pointed out, at the moment, the United States is being convulsed with a whole series of domestic problems, not least of which is problems with race and representation in the United States. And yet there's been very little comment, criticism, or calling out of what's going on in the United States around the Trump regime and the rise of populism there. And there's lots of criticisms that could be made, but it's striking that our government doesn't, and yet is well ahead of the curve in criticizing China over the response to the COVID outbreak in particular, and its role with the World Health Organization. So you can understand why people in Beijing might feel a bit miffed, but you can understand why people of ethnic Chinese descent in Australia might feel a bit miffed with the apparent double standards that are applied to dealing with different countries around the world. That's not to say there's not lots of things wrong with the way that China's been behaving over the last few years. It has been assertive, it has been troubling for many of its neighbours and for Australia to deal with, but that's no reason for entirely siding with the United States in this growing, intensifying struggle for leadership in the world between China and the United States. Now, one of the things that Trump's done is to really undermine multilateralism since he's been in power, and that's obviously a massive negative as far as Australia is concerned, because so-called middle powers like Australia depend on the famous rule-based international order and the kinds of institutionalized practices that multilateral system can encourage, and the fact that both of the major powers, China and the United States, might actually live by some of the principles that multilateral institutions are supposed to embody. So a more kind of even-handed approach to dealing with those kinds of institutions might be useful as far as Australia's concerned. We all hope that Biden's going to get in next week, I think. It's not a gimme at all. Things could go catastrophically wrong in the United States over the next few weeks. We hope it doesn't. But even if Biden does get in, even if he becomes more supportive of multilateral institutions than his predecessor, and he could hardly be less so, he's not going to be terribly sympathetic towards Australia because Australia has not done very much on climate change or the environment, and that's one of the things that Biden is committed to doing something about if and when he actually becomes president. So we're kind of locked in to one side of that debate as well, which is not terribly helpful for having a more kind of flexible response to a changing international environment. One of the other problems that flows from this is that everybody thinks that middle powers ought to be able to bring new ideas, new ways of thinking to the table. And in theory, that's true. But Australia, I think, is so locked into a particular way of thinking about its position in the world and its close relationship with the United States that nobody, certainly in Beijing, takes it terribly seriously as an independent actor. And it's very easy for China to criticize Australia as operating in lockstep or being a kind of stalking horse for the United States in the region. And I don't think that does us any favors either. Now, the particular thing I've been asked to say something about in this very short address is about the implications of climate change for possibly bringing about a more constructive approach on the part of us and on the part of the United States and China as well. And if there's one kind of good news story about climate change, and that's debatable, but if there's one good thing about it, it should be the realization that it's not possible for any country to solve climate change on its own if we don't cooperate on a pretty unimaginable, unprecedented level. It's just not going to happen. So hopefully that kind of is sinking in as an idea in the capitals of China and the United States. It plainly isn't sinking in Canberra, despite the fact that most Australians now regard climate change as a very serious issue and something that's getting worse and affecting Australia fairly directly. And it's pretty hard to dispute the legitimacy of that kind of idea. Now, my basic starting point for thinking about this is that there's no doubt that climate change will get worse and it will alter global politics in significant ways. The only question is how and in what ways. And this could go badly wrong as well. On the other hand, my great hope is that policymakers everywhere, and that includes in the Canberra bubble, will recognize that climate change is the single biggest threat facing humanity and individual states. Climate change is a much bigger threat to the United States than China is, and vice versa. And ditto for Australia, because we're the driest continent on the planet. And if we don't have a serious interest in doing something about climate change, it's hard to know who does. And it's hard to know why we would expect poorer countries or developing economies to do something about it before we do. And yet it seems impossible for the current government to take this kind of thing seriously. And it's certainly very difficult for the kind of strategic elites and policymakers in Canberra to take this kind of issue as seriously as we might hope that they do. Now, on the positive side, China's recently made a commitment to go carbon neutral by 2060, and a couple of countries have followed suit. including South Korea and Japan recently. So there's a bit of a move on in Asia to get some momentum going in that area. Significantly, the Trump administration, of course, will not do anything of a similar sort. And if they get back in again, they will probably continue to undermine the domestic constraints on the fossil fuel industry, and they will do absolutely nothing as far as multilateral cooperation is concerned. So a lot hinges on Biden getting into power. But there's quite a lot that we could do in Australia in the meantime to be a kind of good international citizen and to demonstrate the merits of actually acting independently and trying to build on that emerging momentum to do something serious about climate change before it is too late. And I wouldn't want to be too alarmist about this, but the ICCP said about 10 years ago that we only got 10 years left. And so we've got a very small and rapidly closing window of opportunity to do something about this particular problem. And I think it's absolutely imperative that countries like Australia take this seriously and try to offer some kind of leadership role. Now, the problem is, I think, apart from the political issues and the closeness of this government to the coal industry and various other things, I think one of the more fundamental problems is that security agencies around the world overwhelmingly see security threats in military terms, and even where they take climate change seriously, and there's plenty of evidence that they're wargaming some of the more catastrophic impact of this in places like the Pentagon, at least, even where they take those kinds of threats seriously, they tend to think about responding to them in military terms, rather than trying to address the fundamental problem that's creating the challenges in the first place. And this is just as big a problem in this country as it is anywhere else. The overwhelming emphasis in this country is on conventional military threats. And not only is that arguably inappropriate and almost, if it wasn't quite as expensive, laughable, some of the high profile, hugely expensive armaments purchases that are lined up by the Australian government are unlikely to work, unlikely to be delivered on time, unlikely to address the principal threats to which they're supposedly being addressed, and unlikely to do much for our immediate security at the moment. And by the time the famous submarines are fully deployed in Australia, we'll be talking about 30 years' time. If we don't do something remarkable and unprecedented about climate change in the meantime, preferably in the next 5 to 10 years, then that kind of issue will be a second order issue, to say the least. So, but getting people in this country or any other country for that matter to take some of these kind of issues seriously, to have a kind of paradigm shift in the way that people actually think about the real and immediate dangers and threats to national security that actually confront countries like Australia, is going to be a very, very difficult ask. Despite the last summer and the fairly apocalyptic impact that had on this country, despite the fact that there are still fires raging in the United States at the beginning of autumn, it's very difficult to get many policymakers to take these kinds of threats seriously, despite all of the kind of palpable evidence that they really ought to do so. So you'll have gathered that I think this is a pretty serious kind of threat to our collective well-being. It's pretty difficult to imagine that there's going to be a widespread and effective response in the time available, but it's almost certain that that won't happen while countries like Australia do absolutely nothing to encourage this process to take place and deliberately seek to support one of the countries under the Trump administration, at least, that is most responsible for discouraging responses to this particular threat, despite the fact that it's having a real and immediate impact on our own country at the moment. So this is more of a kind of more set in hope than expectation, because the historical record doesn't give great grounds for being optimistic about this. But I think we've got no choice other than to take this seriously. And when people like me get the opportunity to blather on about this and get a bit overexcited, I think we should, because that's the kind of nature of the problem that we face. And unless we do try to shift the debate in serious and tangible ways, then the outlook is absolutely not good. And if we think that the competition and the tensions between China and the United States are bad at the moment in what is still a comparatively benign environment, and that's in every sense of the word, imagine what they're going to be like in the context of a rapidly deteriorating environment of the natural sort as well. And it's worth remembering, of course, that the coronavirus, which we're also fixated on, is a direct consequence of our collective impact on the natural environment and our encroachment into hitherto pristine bits of the natural environment. If we keep doing that, we're going to have more and more of those pandemics to add to the list of existing environmental threats and challenges that we face. So unless we really have a pretty serious rethink about this, really recalibrate our foreign policy and encourage the major powers to do the same with theirs, then I think the outlook is not bright, to say the least. Sorry about that, but that's the nature of reality.
No, it's Mark, it's wonderful. I think that Mark raises such important issues, the paradigm shiftings. That's hopefully there's some question come back to you later on. So we got quite a lot questions. So what do we do? So maybe there's a few questions addressed to Melissa. So what I do, I might read out, then Melissa, you answer it. So all the audience knows what kind of questions. So I might read out those three questions, all related to the Melissa's. So,
sure, well, I'm happy to have a go at those.
Okay, you go ahead, yeah.
No stress. So I might start with one from Prakash, who is a colleague in two ways, actually. We both studied at Fletcher together, and we're now both involved in the Australian Institute of International Affairs. So good to know you're here. Now, he thinks he's asking one question on how will the election in the US next week affect Australia-China relations. But he's actually asking three, because it's how's it going to change US-China relations? How's it going to change US-Australia relations? And then how is that going to change Australia-China relations? So it's complex. Look, from the first, for the US-China.
Sorry, Melissa, I just cut in. So I have a related announcement. So next month, Deacons will organize a policy forum, discuss the impact American election on the Australia, on the Asia. So related to what you just said, I'm sorry.
No, do the plug. We want people to come along to the next one. Absolutely.
I distribute this events later on.
Yeah. So look, I think in terms of US-China, I don't think the election's going to change it much for what it's worth. So a Biden victory would lead to a different style of US government, but the US-China dynamic, which is full society contestation, that's pretty much set, that's locked in, and it's bipartisan, and it's including in business figures. So I don't think that's going to change very much. We're in a period where there will be that contestation. It might get slightly worse, slightly better, but that's what we're going to see. I think it could have some effects on the Australia-US relationship. I mean, it would have more effect if it was a Trump return, and if it was a long-term contested result, which I hate to say is one of the things I think is most likely at the moment, that if we don't have a clear Biden landslide and it's a contested result, you know, going through the legal process and the floor of the Senate and God only knows what, that's going to have a real effect on American soft power. And it's going to be harder for, you know, an ally like Australia that spent the last 4 years saying, oh, it's okay, you know, this is just a Trump blip, he'll be gone soon, we'll be back to normal, to be going, actually, the US is not what it is in our dreams. You know, we have an idea of the US that it just doesn't live up to anymore, and we might have to change our approach. But look, in terms of what that means for Australia-China, so pulling that through, I might answer that by also responding to Darren Murray's question, which is the US a factor in the deteriorated relationship? And look, I'd say yes to some extent, but perhaps less than you think. So, I mean, clearly a worsening environment of competition and contestation makes it harder for Australia to balance, to be managing our national interest while trying very hard to not to offend either China or the US. So it's harder, fine. But the issues I talked about, they're essentially bilateral issues. They're about how do you manage your relationship, and they were going to be there regardless of what was happening with US-China relations. I suppose if you're depends how big you term the US, you could say, well, yes, there's a lot of cheerleading that goes on, the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue, the US money that goes into the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, the Murdoch Press. Thank you for your question, Yao Wen-Shen. So yeah, I suppose it has an effect there, but I think mostly it's about Australia trying to manage its relationship with China better and more diplomatically.
Okay, so Mark, you want to say something?
This is about the US election and impact on, well, let me just address, there's one question about China's domestic politics and how much of a driver that is. And I think that's an important issue. I mean, it's a two-way kind of dialectical thing, I think. I think Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party clearly have a lot of authority. They control the media. They manage to pump out very kind of pro-nationalist rhetoric and discourse. However, I mean, when you go to China, it's very hard to find anybody who's sympathetic to the fate of Hong Kong and Taiwan. So there's a lot of popular support for that fairly aggressive, assertive, whatever you want to call it, Chinese line in foreign policy. And the unfortunate thing about that, whatever you think about it, it's going to be very hard for the leadership in China to backtrack from that now. So even in the unlikely event that Xi Jinping in particular thought it would be a good idea to have a closer relationship with Joe Biden if he gets in, there are some fundamental hurdles to get over in terms of confidence building and creating an environment in which both countries might feel that they can do something cooperative. Now, surprisingly enough, I'm a bit more optimistic than Melissa perhaps about that, because I really think that, Biden's talking about a Green New Deal and a reset of environmental policy and blah, blah, blah. And there's a sense that he kind of really gets it in a way that plainly Trump doesn't. And that's kind of mildly encouraging. But whether he gets the second part of that equation, that it can't be done on its own, and laudable as a Green New Deal might be for the United States, it doesn't fix the wider problem of which the United States is a part, and it doesn't kind of backtrack from that pro-economic growth policy that's fundamental to all governments around the world. And that, in my view, for what it's worth, is the quintessential problem that governments everywhere have got to wrestle with, because everybody's on a kind of pro-development, pro-growth, pro-expansion kind of thing. And that's been the historical political discourse from governments, be they authoritarian, democratic, or whatever. Any government that doesn't say, oh, we're really interested in jobs and economic development first before everything else, people still look at them with incredulity and think, well, do they really have our interests at heart? And getting people to take a more kind of cosmopolitan view of this, including people in Australia, China, the United States, it's a big ask. And I've got absolutely no confidence in this happening in the amount of time available. But unless we get some enlightened leadership from people like Biden, if he gets in, and Xi Jinping as well, and I think that's what's consequential about this notional commitment to doing something. I think the time frame is not great, but any time frame and any notional commitment to doing something is better than none at this stage. So it's something to build on, something to work with. And there's an opportunity for Australia to say, yes, that's a great idea, we're going to do it too. And imagine what that would do for bilateral relations if Australia actually did something sensible about climate change, or just about anything else for that matter.
That's a great point, Mark makes, and I completely concede that the the area that a Biden election would make most difference in is climate change. And what it would end up doing is essentially wedging Australia. So the US would be pro-action, China is pro-action, and then, Japan and Korea and the EU, they're all pro-action. And we get to the point where if we don't do better, they're going to whack, trade sanctions on all our dirty goods because we're just a laggard. So I think that pressure is going to build and build. So I think that's a great point you make, Mark.
Yeah. So the team, I think there's some question for you. One of the issues is first, by the way, thank you, a wonderful chat about this, how we enter into the debate, whether we need a precondition of the loyalty. This is extremely important normative questions. But there are several concerns. So practically, how Australia can kind of wage a war against this creeping racism towards the Chinese in Australia. So what's your thought practically? What Australia can do? Actually, Australia do that way in some way can help to improve, develop good relationship between China and Australia. Okay.
That question of public loyalty and how you deal with that is obviously one that is forefront to in many people's minds right now, given the ongoing debates. I think it helps by recognizing that not all Australians who may have Chinese heritage think the same. This was a question that was asked by Eric Abetz today in Senate estimates to, I believe, the Secretary of DFAT, Francis Adamson. I quote, "Do all Chinese think alike, or do they have differing views? Are they like Australians where there are a diversity of views within the population?" That's a direct quotation from Eric Abetz from Parliament today. I mean, I don't know how many people of Chinese background Senator Abetz knows, but those of us who do would know that there is a great variety of views among those who have Chinese heritage. We don't look the same and we don't think the same. It ain't that hard to understand. I think if you want to break down some of the prejudice that exists around concerns of disloyalty to Australia, you can start by recognizing that your ethnic heritage does not determine your view of the world or your political position on things. And that's just as it is for any other group in our society. It shouldn't be that hard, I think. We shouldn't be jumping to conclusions about people just based on their background. But that is where the debate has gone. And it's only got to that point because people, our leaders in politics and those in positions of responsibility just haven't clamped down on that kind of lazy thinking. And it's lazy thinking that unfortunately has spread through parts of the parliament. It's unfortunately being propagated through our media as well, going to one of the questions I believe our audience has asked. Melissa in her presentation put up some front pages of the Daily Telegraph and the Herald Sun. The tabloid depictions of the issues involving Australia and China don't aid in this. They can encourage and goad people into racializing the debate about Australia and China. So I think if we're going to deal with these aspects in public debate, we've actually got to just deal with racial prejudice in a more direct way. But unfortunately, we seem to have lost our way, and we're not calling these things out in the way that we should. And I suspect this has something to do with the deterioration of our standards in public debate. When I was at the Human Rights Commission, a lot of my time was devoted to dealing with the debate about the Racial Discrimination Act. But just to refresh people's memory, it wasn't that long ago when you had senior members of the federal government telling Australians that they had a right to be bigots. Well, when you tell people they have a right to be bigots, this is the kind of debate you end up with.
Can I ask Tim a question, Baogang?
Yes, please, Mark.
Because this, I mean, I agree with you wholeheartedly about the underpinning sentiments. But what about the point I was making about the People's Republic of China and the kind of, there's a lot of uniformity. It seems, anyway, it's hard to gauge public opinion in China, as we know. But how about this for a sort of a hypothesis that the level of national unity and unity of sentiment and views in the PRC is strikingly high, and it might have something to do with the authoritarian nature of the regime there, obviously. But in Australia, paradoxically, there is greater diversity of views amongst different ethnic communities and across the population more generally. And it's been argued, I mean, if you look at the United States and what's happening there at the moment, where clearly there's dramatic polarization of opinion in the United States, and that's not necessarily a good thing. So there's a kind of half-baked question in all of that about the nature of nationalism and uniformity of opinion, and whether that's kind of a good thing or a bad thing. Have you got any views about it?
Well, there's got to be enough common ground on some basic principles and questions. I think you can only have meaningful disagreements and contests when you accept certain ground rules, or when you accept certain principles, and I think those principles should involve an entitlement to equal respect and a presumption that you belong to society regardless of your background. I mean, I'm not sure if I've understood your question correctly there, Mark. I mean, it sounds like you've asked me a more general question as opposed to
I'm not sure what the question
relating
is,
to,
but there's a kind of an interesting debate at the moment about the effectiveness of political systems. Authoritarian China is held up by some people as being highly successful, dealt with coronavirus, economies growing again, uniformity, it seems, broadly based support for the government and approval of government policy. Contrast that with, yes, we have plurality of opinion, we've got, you know, rights are being much more respected and people can be and say what they want. And yet, America being the quintessential example, it's a society that's on the verge of tearing itself apart. So, I mean, what are we going to make of that, if anything? Are there any big lessons?
Yeah. Okay, I see where you're getting at, Mark. I mean, I think there are. I think when you're judging a liberal democracy, you've got to judge it as a liberal democracy, and that's not a test that I think you can apply to the People's Republic of China, which clearly is not a liberal democracy. There may be various counts on which the Chinese government or Chinese political society as it currently stands outperforms ours. If you want to be able to build a railway line or build infrastructure efficiently, it helps to be part of an authoritarian political system. That's a lot harder to do when you have property rights and individual rights and the rule of law as we understand it. You simply just cannot, build a railway line wherever you like, or decide that you're going to construct a hospital within 2 days and acquire people's property without any consequences. And so if you're going to measure the technocratic efficiency of political systems, then I think it's hard to argue against the proposition that political states such as China or Singapore are going to do things much better and effectively than liberal democracies such as the United States and Australia would. But I think that's not ultimately the test you should be applying to a liberal democracy. I would say that our political society is inevitably messy and is going to be inevitably inefficient, but that's because we value certain freedoms that other political societies don't. But on the diversity part of the question here, I mean, if we're talking about the diversity of Chinese people in the People's Republic of China versus the diversity of people in Australia who have Chinese backgrounds, I mean, it's quite an interesting question, right? I would warn against thinking that you should be looking at both societies as involving Chinese people, because I think you're talking about members of two different political societies. And I think there's a great deal of diversity that exists in Australia within its Chinese Australian population for a multitude of reasons. You know, it makes a significant difference if you're a Chinese Australian whose family is from Singapore, as opposed to being one whose family is from Hong Kong, or one whose family is from mainland China. So there are historical factors there. But I guess I'm wary of having a culturally determined view of opinion and uniformity.
The sort of essentialism we
that's
don't want to head
against.
towards. Yeah. Well, I might come in a bit on that sort of regime type and COVID-19, because again, I think this has been a fantastic stress test to show you what different countries are made of. And what's come through really clearly is regime type isn't your predictor. It won't tell you whether the country's going to go well or not, whether it's, you know, liberal democracy, authoritarian, communist, whatever. You can find a whole range of countries that have performed extremely well from very different regime types. So Australia and New Zealand, but also Vietnam and also Taiwan. And I wanted to move on to a question we had from Peter McDermott on Taiwan. His questions around, you know, Chinese aggression towards Taiwan. And I suppose I'd start by saying, you know, look, that's very long term, if I can answer that. You know, it's 70 years. Yes, it has been sharper under the Tsai Ing-wen administration rather than a KMT one. But I'm not convinced China's going to upset the apple cart on that particular issue. The status quo has been the status quo for a long time because it's almost the only thing that is acceptable. You know, there is no better accommodation of everyone's interests at the moment than the fiction that, you know, one day Taiwan is going to come back to the fold from the Chinese side, and from Taiwan's side that they'll be allowed to be independent forever, and who knows? So I'm not one of the people who thinks it's going to erupt soon. It would take something extraordinary for China to be willing to do that, I think. Not just the beatings of drums of nationalism at home, because that's always there. It's a huge risk, a huge risk. I just don't think they'll take it very easily. So if I was betting, I'd say the status quo is pretty stable at the moment.
Yeah. Tim, I have a question for you. That, you know, Wayne Kimlick, he written a long time ago. He mentioned a certain pattern or law kind of things, that when a country faces security threats, so multiculturalism will be sacrificed. So you need to deal with national security first. So at the moment, it seems to be that China poses a great security threat towards Australia. So those politicians just identify China as a sort of enemy, as security threats. So when they hold such line, so the multiculturalism must be sacrificed. So it's very much fit in well with this Wayne Kimlick description. He describes this kind of universal pattern in the Europe, in East Europe, and as well in Asia. So I wanted to
respond a little bit on that.
What extent can Australia can go beyond those kind of patterns, those laws?
Well, I don't know. Isn't national security threat in the eye of the beholder? You know, like Marx explained quite clearly, we have the biggest national security threat at the moment and we're just ignoring it. I'm not at all clear that China is an immediate traditional security threat to Australia. You know, that it's going to invade us tomorrow. It's created. We create a sense of national security threat, and we do it for all sorts of reasons. And one of them may be to undermine multiculturalism.
That's right, yeah.
It's possible. So, I mean, I thought, Tim, in some ways, you might be being a little bit kind in saying that some of the people who've been using this rhetoric are essentially just falling into it negligently. They haven't realised the consequences. One possibility is that they are absolutely conscious and they're seeing this as a political gain for themselves, that, it could be a distraction. For example, we have some corruption scandals at the moment, but no, I'm going to be rude to some Asian Australians, and then everybody's going to focus on that rather than on the real problems with the government. It's, that sort of McCarthyism is because you want to build a domestic base, because you want to present yourself as tough and you're the people who hold national security. I'm not sure there is a sense of national security beyond that in what we're seeing at the moment. There's certainly been from my perspective, there's been no change in the overall strategic threat level to Australia between 2014, when we decided we had a comprehensive strategic partnership, to now. It's not like they've suddenly put lots of missiles pointing at Australia in the ground and told us so. Something else has changed. And I think a lot of it is domestic politics and the benefits in there.
Yeah, no, I mean, just on that, I wouldn't for a moment want people to interpret me as thinking that racism is accidental and that all politicians have noble intentions. I've been on the record many times talking about the monetization of racism by our media class and the very blatant racism that we see from sections of our elected representative political class. But to your question, Baogang, I think we've got to avoid seeing a simple choice between multiculturalism and security. Unfortunately, that's the way that the issue can be framed, and it's being framed in that way because there is a sense of underlying insecurity and fear that many Australians feel right now as a result of COVID-19, as a result of the geopolitical situation, as a result of the recession that we're in as well. But if you're talking about security and understanding it in a more sophisticated way, one of the biggest threats we have to our security is internal division. If we have a society that is fractured and divided, that is precisely what makes us weaker, not stronger. And I fear that the fueling of racial prejudice and the demonization of Chinese Australians in public debate is going to have precisely that effect of making our society more fractious, weaker, and therefore that's what's going to harm our security as a society. But I do take your point, Baogang. This is the logic of how political debates play out when people do target multiculturalism or diversity. They do so because they depict, and they do so by depicting multiculturalism and diversity as incompatible with national security or with the national interest. Whereas I think there's a very strong case to be made that our multiculturalism is a strength of our society, and it has always been part of our nation building aspiration and ambition. That multiculturalism was never designed to detract from Australian interests. It's always been about enhancing it and about strengthening it.
That's right, you're right. I think the multiculturalism is a source of great stability for us. But finally, Mark, would you like to come back? You're talking about this paradigm shift. I mentioned this COVID-19 virus, global warming are two biggest existential threat to mankind. So whether we do need a new paradigm to think about those issues, put those issues first and in front of traditional national security. So under this kind of new approach, then we can find a better way to handle Australia-China relations. So this is a go back to your earlier, your book. You mentioned that we need to deal with this global warming. United States, China should work together. Australia should promote, facilitate those G2 to deal with that. So it's just come back to your earlier, this advocacy.
I mean, it's surprisingly easy to lay out a number of things that governments around the world could do that would make a difference. And there are lots of smart people around who know far more about climate change, about the environment, about potential solutions to the particular problems that we face. Ross Garnaut, for example, wrote a brilliant book about how Australia could become a new energy superpower using renewable energy, make a lot of money, employ new people, create a new industry, and fuel the continuing industrialization of Asia. Now, putting aside one question about the economic growth element of that, it's a pretty good blueprint, and you would imagine it will be taken seriously by the people in Canberra. Clearly, they're studiously ignoring it, and if they're not willing to take that kind of thinking on board, which is very much within the existing paradigm in many ways, except that it's not based on fossil fuels and immediately contributing to our worsening environment. So, you know, my point about this is it's possible to imagine that there are lots of sensible things that we could sit around a table and discuss and agree on, that this would be a sensible thing to do. We'd all benefit from putting these kinds of regimes and principles in place. So it's not impossible to think of answers to some of the most complex questions. The problem is the people who run the world at the moment in some of the most powerful countries in the world are not remotely interested, don't understand it, or have vested interests that they're not willing to give up and change the way that they think about the world or the priorities that they attribute to them. So in some ways, I think that people like me are wasting our breath and that nobody takes us terribly seriously or listens to anything we say. And, you know, I mean, I don't expect anybody to listen to me particularly, but Ross Garnaut used to be Bob Hawke's principal economic advisor. He's been a serious and major figure in public policy debates in this country for 30 or 40 years. I mean, he's a pretty serious kind of actor. Nobody takes any notice of him unless he talks about things that happen to fit the particular agenda of the day. And, you know, that was the case in the famous turning towards Asia at the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s. But nobody's been interested in his very serious reports on climate change or his recent book on becoming an energy superpower developed on the back of renewable energy. So the point is, you know, people like us, I mean, there's a failure to take, and I'm not putting myself in this category, but there are some real experts around. Unfortunately, they're not in positions to influence public policy in quite the way that we might hope. And whatever you think about Xi Jinping, he's no dummy. And I think he gets the importance of climate change and he recognizes the potential threat to domestic stability. Because if there's one thing middle-class people in Beijing and Shanghai don't like, it's the thought of their kids being exposed to really serious levels of pollution. They're going to immediately damage their health and have a consequential impact on their futures. So he kind of gets that in a way that some people, Morrison et al., don't really recognize what a colossal threat this is to their political stability and viability as well. So, so I think, you know, in short, it's possible to think of good responses and answers and policies, but it's another question altogether to get people to take them seriously.
Thank you. So anyone would you like to sum up with one sentence, or
we're doomed?
Well, I'll use my one sentence to say we're not doomed. And one of the reasons we're not doomed is so many good people are working on these issues. So yes, governments haven't acted fast enough on climate change, for example. And yes, we've got troubles at, you know, with the Australia-China relationship at the governmental level. But look at how many other actors are working. So, you know, you have NGO coalitions, you have scientific work, you have, you know, city level governance that is doing so much. It's not a substitute. We really want the government level to improve too. But having that, well, I would talk about it as that diplomacy, that international collaboration, that international engagement happening across so many actors. That's one of the things that saves us. And that's my last plug for that's why the Foreign Relations Bill is a bad idea.
Yeah, by the way, Melissa, I like your idea about this national foreign policy law. that your arguments against it all are convincing. I think that Australia diversity plural actor is a great virtue. So if a government wants to centralize it, actually you destroy this great virtue. It's a really pity to do that.
And it means all those other actors have to stay at the same speed as the federal government on climate. No, we want everyone moving ahead on climate and dragging them with it.
King, would you like to say one last words about anything?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just like to see some calm and reason and proportion return to our debate here. And if we're thinking about the current debate about China, just remember that decades on, we look back at McCarthyism and look at it as a disgrace. I suspect we might be looking back at some of the current aspects of the debate now and look at it as a disgrace in future years.
Yes, thank you, Tim. I think your effort is really highly appreciated because of this kind of work. And currently, I think if you look at globally in terms of race politics, Australia's record is still better than United States, than Europe. And we need to do more in this area. Thank you. So thanks all the audience. Thanks all Craig, Mark, Tim, and Melissa. So we see you other times. I own you a beer sometimes. If we can meet together, let's have a beer. Cheers. Thank you. So we have another event next month about the impact of American elections on the Asia in Australia. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.